You know what it feels like to be the kind of hero who walks away before the applause, who saves the day and disappears like smoke before the crowd even looks up. Well, this story will feel far too familiar if you have experienced that feeling. What happens when a rancher saves a town only to vanish before anyone learns his name? Do they remember him or just move on? This is the powerful tale of a forgotten rider buried in memory, lost in silence, until 200 men rode back to town carrying the one medal he never came to claim. If stories like this still matter to you, hit that subscribe button and like the video, because forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered. It had been nearly 16 years since anyone in Dry Creek uttered his name aloud. Not because they didn't remember, but because remembering felt like admitting they'd let something precious slip away. And in a town where pride was stitched into every fence post and flag, admitting failure, even the silent kind, wasn't something folks did easily. Back then, Dry Creek was just another speck on the edge of nowhere. A town of cattlemen, God-fearing women, dusty porches, and boots that had walked too many miles for comfort. It was a hard town, proud but plain. The kind of place where you were either born, buried, or forgotten. And that's exactly what happened to the man they called Trace. Nobody knew if that was his real name. Some thought it was short for something. Others figured it meant he didn't leave one. He'd just shown up one day, lean and tired, with eyes like weathered oak and a horse that looked like it had seen better wars. He didn't talk much, didn't smile much either, but he could mend a fence in silence better than two men with all the words in the world. He rented the old barn just outside town, the one nobody used anymore after old Tom Blake passed. Paid in advance. Never asked for more than a corner to sleep and space for his horse. Folks figured he was either running from something or looking for peace. And in a place like Dry Creek, nobody asked which. They just nodded, let you be, and watched from a distance until they trusted you enough to invite you to Sunday supper. Trace never made it to Sunday supper, but he showed up when it mattered. The first time folks took real notice of him was during the fire. It was the summer of '08, dry as cotton and mean as hell. A lightning strike hit the ridge behind the orphanage, caught flame like the land had been waiting for it. Wind pushed it down the slope fast, and by the time the volunteer fire crew arrived, the flames were licking the fence posts near the children's dormitory. And Trace? He didn't wait for instructions. He rode straight into the smoke, face wrapped in a wet bandana, leading two horses strapped with barrels of water and a saddlebag full of soaked blankets. No speech, no drama, just movement. He worked beside the town's volunteers for nearly 12 hours, quiet, fast, and steady. By dawn, the fire was out, the children were safe, and Trace was back in his barn as if nothing had happened. They offered him thanks. He nodded and walked away. The town noticed, sure, but the next day, life went on. A pie was left at his door. Someone slipped a fresh canteen beside his saddle. But the thing about quiet men is they make you forget they're even there, until the second time. This time, it was bullets. The Dalton brothers, Sam and Eli, came riding into Dry Creek 3 months later, trailing a reputation that dripped blood. From Texas to Colorado. Bank robbers, train hijackers, and mean in a way that wasn't theatrical, it was just plain wrong. They didn't come for money. They came for someone hiding out, someone who had crossed them. And when the saloon doors swung open that Friday evening, and Eli Dalton started spitting names, folks went still as gravestones. It wasn't until he grabbed the town preacher's daughter by the arm and shoved her to the floor that Trace stepped in. He hadn't even been drinking. Just sitting quietly near the back, hat low, hands on a cup of coffee he hadn't touched in 10 minutes. But when the girl hit the floor, he stood. "Let her go," Trace said. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was the kind of calm that made a man like Eli Dalton take one step back without realizing he'd done it. "What's it to you, stranger?" Sam barked from the other side. Trace didn't answer. He just stepped forward. 2 shots were fired that night, only one found. A body. Sam Dalton lay bleeding in the doorway. Eli? Gone. Ran so hard his boots were found 10 miles out by the cattle creek, torn and twisted like the man had run out of his own skin. The sheriff asked no questions. The townspeople whispered thank yous. But Trace disappeared before the coffee. Got cold. Rode out the next morning before the sun cracked the hilltop. Left behind nothing but a rifle leaning against the porch rail of the church and a silver badge no one knew he carried. After that, he was gone. Just gone. No trail, no note. Not even the name, Trace, scratched into the barn post where he used to tie his horse. The town searched for a week, then a month. But eventually, life pulled them back into its usual rhythm, branding, birthing, burying. The stories became softer. The memories blurred. And before long, Dry Creek did the one thing it never meant to do. It forgot his face. But 16 years later, everything changed with the sound of distant hooves. At first, the sheriff thought it was thunder. Then the blacksmith stepped outside and counted the silhouettes rising over the ridge. Not 5, not 10, but a sea of riders' shoulders squared, hats lowered, and dust clouds rising behind them like the past had finally come home. 200 riders, all of them heading straight into town. And every single one of them wearing the same emblem pinned to their chest. A silver badge with no name, just one word etched in the metal: Trace. But we'll get to that part soon, because before that moment, before the dust settled and the town remembered, there was one final piece of the story that still needed telling, a truth buried in the quiet years between disappearance and return. And when you hear it, you'll understand why some heroes leave, and why the good ones never come back for their medals. The dust from the riders hadn't yet settled on the outskirts of Dry Creek when the memories began to stir again. Faces turned pale. The baker dropped a tray of fresh loaves. The old sheriff, now more silver than salt, stared into the distance with eyes that didn't blink. Something about the way those riders carried themselves, silent but solid, told everyone watching that they hadn't come for ceremony. They'd come for something long overdue. But to understand how they ended up here 200 strong, united by one forgotten man, you'd have to follow the trail that led away from Dry Creek 16 years earlier. Back when Trace left without a word, carrying only a saddlebag, a worn journal, and a weight heavier than any metal could balance. The truth was, Trace hadn't expected to be remembered. He didn't act out of duty, nor pride, nor glory. He acted because something inside him didn't know how to do anything else. The fire, the Dalton brothers, Those were chapters in a longer story. A life quietly built on a code written somewhere, deep beneath the scars on his hands. After leaving Dry Creek, Trace rode west, not for destination, but for distance. Towns blurred, names faded, and every place he stopped, he helped fix something broken. A fence, a wounded mule, a falling porch roof on a one-room schoolhouse. People rarely asked where he came from. He wasn't the type to invite conversation, but he always left something behind, something better than how he'd found it. In a town just outside of Santa Mesa, he worked for a widow whose roof had collapsed during a storm. He stayed only long enough to rebuild the beams, reinforce the rafters, and carry her firewood closer to the hearth. She offered him coins, which he politely declined. Instead, he left before dawn and nailed a note to the doorframe with just 4 words: "You're stronger than you think." Another town, months later, he saved a young boy from drowning in the irrigation ditch that split through the farmland like a forgotten scar. The boy had fallen in trying to retrieve a fishing rod. When Trace pulled him out, soaking wet and shivering, he didn't say much, just wrapped the boy in his coat and left him by his mother's stoop. No thanks asked. No name given, but word travels, even when names don't. Somewhere between the deserts of New Mexico and the cliffs of northern Arizona, the stories began to weave together. Folks in different towns started comparing tales of a man who never stayed long, but always left something behind. They called him different things: the Ridge Ghost, the Saddle Sate, the Quiet Rider. But those who'd really looked him in the eye knew better. They didn't need his name to remember his heart. One of them was a war veteran turned rancher named Elias Crow. Elias had lost everything in a flood that took half his cattle and most of his will to keep going. Trace showed up during a lightning storm, asked no questions, and helped him dig trenches all night long. When dawn came, Trace had already saddled up again. Elias never forgot. And years later, when he heard of other men, dozens of them, who'd had similar encounters, he started writing letters. Not emails, not newspapers. Handwritten notes sent by mail, telegram, even word of mouth. He created a map of kindness scattered across 5 states, and at the center of it was a man no one could quite describe, but everyone remembered the same way. It was Elias who had the idea first. If the man wouldn't take a medal when he earned it, maybe he'd accept it if it came with 200 riders behind it. So he started organizing. It took 3 years to find them all. Ranch hands, teachers, bakers, even a few reformed men who'd once worn outlaw scars. All of them had been touched, saved, or silently helped by Trace in one way or another. Some had never seen his face, only heard his voice or read his note. But it didn't matter. They all remembered. And so, one morning in late spring, they met on the southern edge of the Dustwood Plateau. 200 horses, 200 stories, and one single purpose: to ride back to Dry Creek, to the town that never gave him thanks, and deliver the honor he never came to claim. Back in Dry Creek, the town was waking up to the sound of something long buried. The youngest didn't understand the commotion. The middle-aged remembered only bits and pieces, stories passed down or overheard in saloons. But the elders, the ones who'd seen the fire, the gunfight, the quiet man on the ridge, they stood silently, hearts thick with guilt and awe. They realized, perhaps too late, that some debts cannot be measured in time. only in intention. And while the town tried to piece together their collective memory, Trace was hundreds of miles away, unaware of what was coming. At a place called Widow's Spur, tucked in a forgotten valley near the canyons, he'd finally settled into something resembling stillness. Not a home, but a holding place. A small wooden cabin, built by his own hand, with a porch that faced the east, so he could see the sun rise before anyone else. He didn't keep clocks or calendars. Just the rhythm of the wind and the whistle of birds that perched on the railing. As if they too had nowhere else to be. He'd grown older. Lines now creased his once sharp features, and silver threaded through his hair like winter dusting a dark mountain. But his eyes, those same steady, weather-worn eyes, hadn't changed. They still held stories. Still held silence. Still held the burden of being remembered by everyone except the place that once needed him most. But he hadn't grown bitter. If anything, he had come to terms with the nature of memory. That some people pass through your life like a flash of lightning, bright, necessary, and gone before you realize what they were. And maybe, just maybe, that was his role all along. Still, something stirred in the wind that day. A quiet unease he couldn't name. He stood on the porch and looked west, not knowing that just past the ridge, 200 riders were closing in, their hooves pounding out a rhythm louder than any applause he'd ever received. They were coming. And with them, not just a medal, but a reckoning, a recognition, a redemption. But the town had one more thing to face before the story came full circle, and Trace. He had one more truth to accept. By the time the first rider crested the hills just south of Dry Creek, the town had already changed, though not in brick or timber, but in spirit. For a place that once ran on routine and small-minded habits, it now found itself holding its collective breath. Even those who barely remembered Trace Forrester had begun to speak his name again tentatively, like it was sacred or fragile, unsure whether they had the right to say it out loud after all these years of silence. The livery boy, barely old enough to know what a medal truly meant, had taken to asking every older man who passed by what Trace had done. And the answers, though varied, all pointed to something deeper than gunfire or gallantry. He'd protected the town without asking for applause, disappeared without demanding recognition, and left behind nothing but a legacy nobody cared to preserve until now. The old sheriff, a man whose back had bowed under both time and regret, stood at the edge of town each morning, eyes locked toward the horizon. He didn't say much. Didn't need to. Everyone knew he'd once stood beside Trace on the ridge, shoulder to shoulder, watching flames lick the sky, while panic spread through the valley like a flood. And when Trace left covered in soot, hands raw from pulling children from burning buildings, the sheriff didn't stop him. He didn't offer thanks or justice or the simple dignity of acknowledgement. He just let him ride. That failure had never left him. So now, as the line of riders began to appear over the hilltop like shadows stretched across the land, he was the first to feel it in his chest, that low, unrelenting beat of truth finally coming home. They arrived in waves. Not a parade, not a show, just quiet resolve moving as one. The sound of hooves on dry earth was all the town heard for a while. No banners, no music. Only the rustle of leather, the glint of old spurs, and the creak of saddle-worn memories. And They weren't what Dry Creek expected. They weren't young guns or silver-tongued cowboys trying to relive old myths. They were weathered men and women people touched by time, carrying the dust of towns too small to name. A few wore military pins. Others bore scars that told stories more vivid than words ever could. And every one of them had come for the same reason: Trace. Elias Crow led the front, broad-shouldered, steely-eyed, a man who'd once lost everything and then found something again because a stranger didn't turn away. He rode tall, carrying no weapon but a sealed wooden box strapped to his saddle, polished clean but faded at the edges. Inside it was the metal, the same one Dry Creek had once voted not to deliver, believing Trace would turn it down anyway. Behind Elias rode Sam Duke, who'd learned to walk again after Trace found him barely conscious on a trail in Montana. Then came Miri Sandoval, who'd never forgotten the man who gave her father his last winter's firewood and asked for nothing in return. Story after story rode behind them, 200 hearts, stitched together by one man's silent goodness. Dry Creek didn't know what to do. Some stood in doorways. Others leaned against fence posts, hats in hand, watching the procession roll in without fanfare, but with something weightier respect born not from myth but memory. And as the riders lined up in the square, the silence deepened, like the whole town was holding a secret it was finally ready to say out loud. Elias dismounted first. He didn't call for attention. He didn't wave for a crowd. He just looked around the town with those sharp eyes of his, then finally spoke low and even. "We're not here for ceremony," he said, almost like he was talking to Trace, not the town. "We're here to return something that never should have been left behind." He opened the box. Inside lay a silver medal, its ribbon faded, its inscription barely visible under the years. It had been commissioned by Dry Creek after the fire, and the Dalton standoff meant to be the town's way of saying thank you. But when Trace left without warning, no one followed. No one even asked why. The medal was shelved in the back room of the mayor's office, and over time, everyone moved on. Everyone. Except Elias. And now, that forgotten token gleamed once more under the western sun. "We brought it because he won't," Elias continued. "He won't come back for applause. But maybe he'll come back if he knows people remember him for the right reasons." The town didn't clap, they didn't cheer, but a quiet shift ran through the crowd like wind through dry wheat. Faces softened, shoulders dropped, and in the quiet, something settled in the realization that sometimes a man doesn't need a welcome party. He just needs to know his absence wasn't wasted. Back at Widow's Spur, Trace stood on the edge of the bluff behind his cabin, staring out at the canyon. He didn't know the exact moment the riders reached Dry Creek, but he felt something change in the air. A heaviness lifted. A strange stillness settled. He hadn't planned on ever going back. Not because of anger, not even bitterness, but because he thought his part of the story had already ended. He didn't know there were still chapters waiting. The next morning, he found a rider waiting on the trail. It was Miri. She didn't say much, just handed him a letter, the envelope soft from miles on the trail. Inside were two things: a photo of the medal and a note from Elias that said they remembered. "Maybe it's time you did too." Trace didn't ride out that day or the next. It took him 3 dawns to gather what he didn't even know he still had: a clean shirt, a well-oiled saddle, and the strength to face a town he'd buried years ago. But on the fourth morning, the sun rose over Widow's Spur and caught the glint of stirrups against dew. The birds watched him go. The porch creaked like an old friend saying goodbye. And the trail back to Dry Creek waited not with fanfare, but with forgiveness. In the final stretch of this journey, the story would come full circle, but not in the way anyone expected. Not with speeches or salutes or brass bands. No, Trace Forrester's return would be quieter than all of that. And somehow far more powerful. When Trace rode into Dry Creek for the first time in 16 years, the morning air held that odd kind of stillness, like the town itself was holding its breath. The sun was still climbing above the hills. The storefronts hadn't yet unlatched their windows, and even the birds seemed slower to sing. There was no crowd waiting, no banners strung up between dusty lampposts. But that was never what this return was about. He wasn't the kind of man who needed a parade. In truth, he probably would have turned right around if there had been one. But someone had swept the front of the sheriff's office. The old wooden bench had been patched, and fresh coffee was brewing in the general store. The smell carried on the breeze like a soft invitation. Trace noticed these details the same way he always had, quietly, inwardly, letting them settle into the hollow spaces he hadn't realized were still there. He didn't rush. He never did. His horse moved at a slow, steady pace down the main stretch of town, past folks who pretended they weren't watching but couldn't quite help themselves. Some peeked through curtains. Others leaned a little too long on porch rails, their hands tightening unconsciously around coffee mugs or brims of old hats. They all remembered him in pieces, a blurred face at the edge of a fire, a hand gripping the reins of an injured deputy's horse, the quiet voice that gave calm directions while everyone else panicked. But time had dulled their memory, made it easier to forget, to justify their silence. Now, as Trace passed by again, older, weathered but upright, the memory came back in full. Elias stood near the edge of the square, the wooden box in his hands, the metal still inside, not polished, not pristine, just honest, like the man it had been meant for. Trace didn't dismount immediately. He looked around instead, took in the way the sun fell across the chapel steeple, how the wind toyed with the flags on the porch railings, and how slowly but surely people began stepping outside. No one said his name, not yet, but their presence spoke what their mouths couldn't. He finally climbed down, his boots landing with the soft thud of memory on old dirt. Elias didn't move to greet him. He just waited, holding the box like a burden he was ready to pass on. "You could have sent it in the mail," Trace said, his voice a touch rough, like old fence wood creaking in the wind. Elias gave a quiet huff. "And you would have opened it?" Trace looked away for a long moment. "No, probably not." A pause. And then Elias extended the box. "It's yours, always was." Trace didn't reach for it. "Not yet. I didn't come back for a medal," he said, his eyes sweeping across the slowly growing crowd. "Didn't come for forgiveness either." "What then?" asked Elias, gently. Trace looked past him, toward the old schoolhouse, the chapel, the Crook's saloon that had somehow still survived, toward the young stable hand standing nervously beside the sheriff, barely able to keep his eyes from the box in Elias's hands. Then he looked toward the hills where the fire once raged and the town once failed to remember. "I guess I came to remember it myself," he said, "because I spent too long pretending none of it mattered." A quiet settled again, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that holds weight, the good kind, the meaningful kind. The kind people don't want to break. Trace took the box. He didn't open it, just held it, his thumbs tracing the grain of the old wood like it carried stories no one else could read. He didn't need to look at the metal. He remembered it well enough from the sketches, from the brief moment it was commissioned. It was never about the shine or the words. It was about someone saying you mattered. Even if they said it too late, the town didn't burst into applause. There was no dramatic swell of music. Instead, something better happened. A woman stepped forward widowed during the Dalton standoff, the very one Trace helped save. She brought with her a photograph, faded and creased. It showed Trace, just barely visible, carrying her daughter from a smoke-filled alley. She offered it to him, not like a gift, but a gesture. A thank you. A proof of memory. Next came the blacksmith's wife, who'd once run a soup kitchen after the fire for displaced families. She brought a ladle brass, old but polished. She handed it over and said softly, "You gave me the strength to keep going." And one by one, they came. Not all, not everyone, but enough. People with stories, people with memories, people who'd buried their gratitude under layers of habit and forgetfulness, now unearthing it one by one. Trace didn't say much through it all. He just listened, accepted, nodded, let it all soak in. Later that evening, as the orange sun sank behind the hills and cast long shadows across the fields, Trace sat alone on the porch of the sheriff's office. The box rested on his lap. He hadn't opened it still. Just sat with it, like a man finally at peace with something he couldn't name. The sheriff joined him, slowly, with 2 mugs of coffee. "You planning to stay?" he asked. Trace didn't answer right away. "I don't know," he finally said. "Maybe not forever, but maybe long enough." They sat in silence after that. No need for more words. And in that quiet, something unspoken passed between them. A reckoning. A release. A kind of quiet redemption that didn't need to be declared. It just was. Days turned into weeks, and Trace began walking the town again. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a man seen and known. He repaired the fence at the churchyard, helped the school teacher install new desks, shared coffee with Elias in the mornings. He didn't speak of the medal, didn't need to. But one evening, he did place it on the mantel of the old town hall, not for pride, not for recognition, but so no one would ever forget again. And as for the 200 riders, they didn't stay. They had their own lives, their own roads, their own debts to honor. But before they left, they each placed something small, symbolic, heartfelt into a box Trace kept near the door. A letter, a photo, a scrap of cloth. Every piece was a thank you. Every piece said the same thing in a different way. You changed something. You mattered. In the end, Dry Creek didn't just remember Trace Forrester. They reclaimed him, and perhaps more importantly, Trace reclaimed himself. Because sometimes redemption doesn't come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly on horseback, with no script, no grand gesture, just 200 riders, one long ride home, and a man finally ready to believe he was never forgotten. Asterisk.